Iron Man 2 is our first sequel in the MCU, coming out 2 years after the last MCU project, The Incredible Hulk. This felt like the first project they decided to go all in on the cinematic universe concept, with Sam Jackson's Nick Fury put in a supporting role and Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow being introduced for the first time to tie heavily into the at-the-time in development Avengers film. Jon Favreau returns to direct this film, and with all that said, let's take a look back at 2010's Iron Man 2. Iron Man 2 takes place around Tony's Stark Expo event. Tony is facing an exponential crisis when he's getting poisoned by the arc reactor that saves his life. This leads Stark to fall into drinking and walking back a bit on his arc. Rhodey sees what's going on with Tony and wants to forfeit his Iron Man armors to the government, which the government is actively trying to get at this time due to Senate hearings about trying to get the weapons technology from Stark. At the same time, we have Ivan Vanko, who wants to get revenge on Tony Stark for his father essentially throwing Vanko's father under the bus back in the day. This leads to him developing his own suit with whips to try to kill Tony. When this fails, he's saved by Justin Hammer, who recruits him to make Iron Man suits for Hammer Industries. However, Vanko creates drones instead, and on the night of Hammer's Stark Expo, the suits are taken over by Vanko, who uses the suits to attack Tony and Rhodey, who are now Iron Man and War Machine respectively. They fight, and Vanko's drones are defeated. Jon Favreau developed Iron Man 2 as the second part in an Iron Man trilogy he originally hoped to see to its conclusion. It didn't take long after the original Iron Man for Terrence Howard to be replaced with Don Cheadle, who has held the part of Rhodey or War Machine ever since.
It's me. I'm here. Deal with it. Let's move on.
I just
Drop it. All right. I'll drop it.
Howard left due mostly to money negotiations. It's unknown if it was Marvel or Howard's legal team that pulled the plug, but regardless of how it went down, Don Cheadle took over the role and hasn't looked back since. Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. wanted to do an adaptation of Demon in the Bottle, but with their own twist on it, based on Robert Oppenheimer's experience after he created the atomic bomb. The script originally had several villains, including Ghost, who would later appear in Ant-Man and the Wasp years later, but ultimately it was whittled down to just Justin Hammer and Whiplash. Sam Jackson almost didn't come back, but after negotiations ultimately rejoined the cast along with Scarlett Johansson, joining as Black Widow, though the role initially was eyeballing Emily Blunt. The studio again went with Stan Winston Studios and ILM for most of the effects work, which looks pretty consistent with the first film. In this film, Tony felt a bit like a backstep when it comes to his arc, but I think it was an intentional choice that wouldn't fully pay off. As I said, the alcoholism arc was based on Robert Oppenheimer, but I think the alcoholism's a little undercooked in this film as it's really only one or two scenes where it affects Tony heavily. Tony's other big personal arc is that he never felt worthy to his father, and at the same time is being poisoned by the arc reactor. These arcs eventually merge when he learns his father did find him worthy, and figured that only Tony could find the hidden element his father discovered, which could also help him stop the poisoning that's happening through the arc reactor. Pepper hasn't changed much for this film, sadly, still kind of just being Tony's moral core while Tony's off doing crazy Iron Man stuff. Gwyneth Paltrow, I think, puts in a better performance here than the first film, but there isn't a lot to talk about with Pepper in this one. Rhodey finally suits up as War Machine after confiscating an armor from Tony, seeing that alcoholism has made him unhinged and believing the government would be better off with the armor. He goes to Tony's arch-rival Justin Hammer to arm the suit further, but eventually realizes the error of his ways and works with Tony to stop the rogue drones Justin Hammer sent out at the Stark Expo. Black Widow goes undercover as an assistant at Stark Industries to keep an eye on Tony. In reality, she's the secret agent Black Widow. In the comics, Black Widow started as a villain before eventually becoming a hero and worked frequently with people like S.H.I.E.L.D., Daredevil, the Avengers, and Hawkeye. Justin Hammer is a rival to Tony, who basically wants to create his own brand of Iron Man suits. In the comics, he was British, which was changed in the film to make him more similar to Tony, and also give him this image of an American industrialist. In a way, he's basically the mirror image of Tony if Tony was less brilliant, not humbled by the attack from the Ten Rings. Whiplash, or Ivan Vanko, hates Tony Stark and vows revenge on him after his father threw his father under the bus with illegal dealings. However, in the comics there were several different Whiplashes. In the case of Ivan specifically, he wasn't introduced till mere months before the film came out. In the comics version, Vanko had a village slaughtered by an Iron Man imposter. This caused Vanko to be hell-bent on revenge, and he became the newest Whiplash. There's also Professor Vanko, that was only ever the Crimson Dynamo, but never Whiplash as far as I know. That version is probably closest to Vanko from the film, but rather than working with the Soviets in the film, Vanko was an independent until he joined Justin Hammer. Nick Fury in this film is able to use an antidote to buy Tony Stark a little more time alive. That said, his main goal is trying to get a copy of the Iron Man armor, as he wants Iron Man in the Avengers, but not Tony specifically. He is more important in this film, but still kind of just another cameo appearance from Nick Fury. The Iron Man films, specifically Iron Man 3, can be pretty well noted for the insane amount of armors in them, and this film certainly stepped it up from what we saw in the first film, though it's definitely not as crazy as Iron Man 3, which is going to be a mouthful. Mark IV, the armor is pretty close to the Mach 3, used to replace the suit after the damage done to the Mach 3 after his fight with Obadiah Stane. The suits are functionally similar. Mach 5 is Tony's portable suit, able to fit in a suitcase. It was used as a portable option during his fight with Whiplash. In the early comics, Tony was able to fit his suit into a briefcase, so this was probably an homage to that. Mach 6 was created when Tony created his new element that allowed for higher power output. This suit is notable for the triangular arc reactor port, something that was only used on this suit. This seems like a bit of a half step to Tony's classic Silver Centurion armor from the comics, which also had the triangular chest piece. War Machine Mach 1 was a retool of the Mach 2 Iron Man armor we saw in the original film, this time with a more militaristic twist. Much like the comics, it's basically a heavily armored black and silver version of Iron Man's primary suit. Hammer drones. Ivan Vanko created drones for Justin Hammer's company, one for each branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, that are more or less based on Iron Man's design philosophy. Whiplash had two different suits in the film, one which was a bare-bones chest plate with whips attached, and the other that was a more fortified Iron Man-like armor based on the Hammer drones. The main comic this film takes from is Demon in the Bottle, but again the film changed the storyline a bit. Demon in a Bottle from the comics, like the film, has Whiplash and Hammer, but unlike the film, also has a story with Namor the Submariner and other villains appear as well. In the comic story arc, which is actually more like two story arcs with the overarching drinking plot, Tony starts drinking heavily and it affects his role as Iron Man. It's two okay arcs with the drinking plot being unique for the time, but little else. The drinking is also very passively mentioned at first. In the film, Tony drinks because he's dying. In the comics, Tony gets a drinking problem. That's the key difference. I find this arc most memorable due to the cover of Iron Man 128, honestly, which caps off the run. The end credit scene in Iron Man 2 shows Phil Coulson drive up to Thor's hammer and call Fury about it. It's basic, but reveals that Thor was coming as the next movie. This is still an era of Marvel before they kind of locked down the end credits tease fully, and this was very bare bones, essentially made to tease that future film. I actually really like Iron Man 2. It's a large step down from the original Iron Man. It's kind of like a more popcorn munching version of the original film, if that makes sense. There's still some heavy themes, but the film is kind of a lighter ride. I like the villains in the film. It kind of does the mirror villain thing the first film did again with the rival suit and drones. However, it isn't very derivative in the final battle when compared to the original final battle, so it isn't the most bothersome thing. I love Justin Hammer. Just the idea that there's this entitled Stark without talent who was never humbled the way Tony was is kind of interesting to me. And Ivan Vanko ties well into the father themes throughout the film, and is certainly not a bad MCU villain, but he definitely isn't the most special or memorable either. This movie has a fast pace and it's pretty much exactly what I want from a popcorn action film. If I had one major criticism of the film, it would be that Tony kind of takes a half step back from his arc in the first film where he's a little more cocky and less responsible again. Although I think that was used as a way to handle the alcohol abuse arc, which I think was still a little undercooked. The score is kind of your generic Iron Man music, but suited the movie pretty well, much like the first film. It was backed with AC/DC music, which really works well for the character and is something that I think is pretty pivotal and iconic for Tony Stark. This film doesn't have the biggest reading list, but I would recommend Demon in the Bottle, at least the second arc. It's a seminal Iron Man run, and the film kind of touches on it. I would also read some of the early appearances of Black Widow because that character's evolution is pretty interesting, but otherwise there aren't a ton of comics I can really recommend for this film. Overall, Iron Man 2 is more of a fun popcorn film than the first one, but I still really enjoy it for what it is. It introduced a lot of characters that have become important to the larger lore of the Infinity Saga and beyond, and expanded on smaller characters like Nick Fury. I don't really understand why this film is considered on the lower end of the MCU spectrum, just because it has such a strong kinetic energy to it, much like the first film, with people like Robert Downey Jr. making it frankly a really fun experience and a really great ride. Next time we'll be looking back at Thor, the star of one of the longest running MCU series, and one that I think has a bit of an identity crisis over the years. Anyways, tune in next time. Thanks for watching.